This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good evening, one and all, and thank you for joining me on this bank holiday evening for an in-depth look at assessment with a particular eye on the foundation subjects. So hopefully you've had a restful weekend and you're ready to dive into some thinking, because tonight my guest is someone who is so fascinated with assessment and everything that's related to it that he's writing a master's dissertation on the subject. So this promises to be a great chat, so sit back, enjoy and call or text in.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Okay, so tonight we are going to get into all things assessment. So there's been an awful lot of discourse over the last few years around curriculum design. That's understandably been a massive priority, particularly with the new Ofsted inspection framework that we had some years ago now. And that's given curriculum sequencing its rightful space as a priority area for many school leaders. But assessment is now where a lot of schools' thinking is moving to. And we're really keen to get into that topic tonight to really unpick some of the really key thinking that school leaders and teachers should be doing around that particular area if we're going to move our assessment practices in line with our curriculum design and sequencing practices. So there's lots and lots of things that we're going to try and get into as we go through the course of this conversation tonight. But one of the big things is this idea of end-of-unit tests. And some years ago, when assessment started to kind of move back onto back into the mainstream thinking for a lot of teachers and leaders, end-of-unit tests were a particular area that people started to focus on. But the question remains, are they really useful? Do we always use them in the most useful way? Do they really show us performance, or do they show us learning? And if we understand that memory is the residue of thought, as Dan Willingham told us, to what extent do end-of-unit tests give us a real read on what pupils have remembered? So what do you want pupils to be thinking about beyond the end of that unit? And are we really testing that and putting those really key facts and points and key learning into those end-of-unit tests? Overall, we think they're pretty useful, but we need to think about where they're placed, and that's something that we're going to get into tonight as well. Do we place them right at the end of a unit, or do we allow for some time to elapse between finishing a unit and running our test? And of course, above all else, what we need to remember is that they're not the only assessment action that we need to take into account and take into our thinking. Assessment is so multifaceted that it's really important that we consider each factor or each facet of assessment as part of that wider suite. So assessment as previously thought of as having I'm back. Assessment has previously been thought of as just having that one purpose of giving us that summative judgment at the end of a unit or at the end of a piece of learning. But of course, it's much more than that as well. And that's another factor that we're going to get into tonight. We're going to think about assessment of learning, but also we're going to think about assessment for learning, and crucially, the third factor of assessment, which is assessment as learning as well, whether the actual act of assessment is good for the learning process. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring my guest into the fold. So Matt, do you just want to give us a little bit of a run through of your story, where you started, where you're at now, and everything in between?
My story. So I've been teaching for 11 years. The school I currently work in is London. I've been assistant head there since this September. My remit has been assessment across the school. And that sort of it's taking in all the data from the school and analysing that. But really, as you mentioned, my project is my main project this year has been working on assessment within the foundation subjects. So as you sort of mentioned, foundation subjects, looking at bringing them sort of up to the same sort of speed as our core subjects, maths, reading and writing, trying to put in a bit more of a robust assessment system in place for that and sort of really raise the profile of those subjects themselves. So yeah, that's kind of that's kind of my story.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Okay, welcome back, Matt. So just before we had those adverts, you were telling us about your current role and your current school. You've been teaching for sort of just over 10 years now, and you've got responsibility for leading assessment across the school with a particular emphasis on the foundation subjects. And you were saying that that's where a lot of your attention is at the moment, making sure that the foundation subjects have got the same level of priority that we've traditionally given to reading, writing, and maths. So it feels like a fairly sensible place to start would be around the different purposes of assessment as you see them. So do you want to kick us off with that?
What I've been working towards the idea of three different definitions of assessment that I've introduced to our staff. So it's probably worth going through those. That's assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And these three, I know certainly before I got into thinking about this, I kind of just thought of assessment as learning, thinking, where are my children? Where do I go for the next lesson? And that was about it. So if we start with assessment of learning, this is really identifying what pupils seem to know or what they don't understand at any given time. And that's generally within the lesson, and that is the teacher's role in a nutshell. And then really, as part of a teacher, as assessment of learning, you really need those curriculum endpoints all the time. So, for example, in history, if you're working towards source, for example, we have some curriculum threads in our school where it's labelled really quickly, for source, what does that look like in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and year 6. So you know as a teacher that's what you're working towards. If we think assessment for learning is again has a slight difference to it, and these assessment for learning are the assessment cycles which involve the teacher-pupil exchange, and that's with the main aim of identifying their misconceptions so that you as a teacher can be responsive to them and address them and really identify those gaps. And that really thinks about how does this lesson lead into the next bit within this unit of study. And the work I've done with our staff has really been thinking about choosing the best strategy for the assessment practices there. So for just to give an example, when is it appropriate to use things like mini whiteboards as opposed to just cold calling and asking children what the answer is of a given topic or knowledge. So, for example, mini whiteboards might be a really good use, might be used really effectively if you want a full explanation answer, but are you really as a teacher going to be able to read those that quickly? Whereas cold calling, if used appropriately and appropriate for your context, that can be really trying to find out, getting all those children engaged and thinking what have they remembered. Something else that leads into it is things like multiple choice hinge questions. So when you're working through a lesson, these multiple choice hinge questions allow you, it's a really key piece of knowledge or key piece of learning. What do the children need to know before they can move on to the next part of the lesson? I think it's worth coming back to that, where we think about, for example, when you're teaching history in year 3, as an example, if I'm teaching the Tudors and the Battle of Hastings in year 3, it's really important that the children have gained that substantive knowledge about why were York and Lancaster fighting in the War of the Roses, and thinking about the Battle of Hastings there. So in the really key substantive knowledge that the children have to know in that first part of your lesson when you're covering that is they have to know why are they fighting, so that when you come on to the second part of the lesson and you're thinking about when Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, why was that marriage so important for the peace in Tudor Britain at that time? So these sorts of hinge questions, these assessments for learning, this really helps the teacher to know, how do I assess what my children have got in this moment so that I can move on to the next part? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that the really interesting bit there is that you've zoomed in on one particular bit of knowledge that you would be covering in a lesson or over a course of lessons that's particularly important to unlocking what's to come next. And you talk about that in a similar way that kind of reminds me of some of David Didal's work around really making sure that you identify threshold concepts and where those threshold concepts are, and these points in lessons or in sequences of learning where if we don't go through this next little threshold all together and really, really clearly, then what's to follow is going to end up being slightly more confusing than what we want it to be. So you talk a little bit about making sure that you use hinge questions at that point as well. Do you want to just go into a little bit more depth about what and multiple choice hinge questions in particular? Do you want to just give us a little bit more depth on what a multiple choice hinge question would be and how you might design one of those and put one together?
Yeah, of course. It's also worth noting, it's that I should have said the Battle of Bosworth, not Hastings. Someone's corrected me in the chat. I definitely wrote Bosworth. But the idea of a hinge question and designing that as a multiple choice question, I've worked with our staff on making sure these hinge questions have deliberate distractors in them. And by deliberate distractors, I mean plausible answers. So, for example, we all remember watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And, A, B, C, and D, option D was ridiculous. And we don't want that for the children, where the answer is plainly obvious by a process of elimination through the options there. So it's about really thinking clearly about those multiple choice options that you provide, and are they close enough or plausible enough to the correct answer that really makes the children engage with the thinking from the topics that you've taught. And again, so that's really important in terms of the multiple choice elements. In terms of really choosing those hinge questions, it's about, particularly if you're thinking about substantive knowledge, it's about really being clear on the medium-term plans that are written by your subject leads. What is the clear substantive knowledge that those children have to know by the end of the lesson and the end of the unit, and how that feeds in to their work and progression throughout the school. So it's being really clear, and we've done a lot of work in our school about, on our medium-term plans, highlighting off the key substantive knowledge that the children have to have in that lesson over the course of the medium-term plan. And so building your hinge questions around those key points. Because as teachers, we're all very good at going off on tangents and talking about things that are interesting the children, but it's really important to bring it back to what is that key substantive knowledge, and then those hinge questions built around that with the deliberate distractors in, as I mentioned, to really make the children engage with their thinking.
Yeah, great. And that's super interesting as well, because if you think about those hinge questions and the options that you're putting in there, you called them deliberate distractors. But if you think about one of the core functions of assessment, we often think of it as being about identifying what children can do and what they already know, when in actual fact, one of the core functions of it is to identify what they don't know and what they can't already do. So to identify their misconceptions. So when it comes to designing those deliberate distractors, designing them, in such a way as to highlight potential misconceptions if children do select them, is something that's often well worth considering. Because of the information that it will give you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And I think when I've been working with a smaller group of staff in terms of this project and develop those ideas and sort of really pushing them to be responsive to what are the misconceptions that come up within those lessons, and almost reflecting those back at the children through those multiple choice questions to pretty much ensure those misconceptions that have come up can then be eliminated, so it's not a persistent misconception.
Yeah, good stuff. I mean, and I think that's, again, it comes back to that idea that question of why you're assessing, why are you asking that question at that point. And so often it is about wanting to know what the misconceptions are and misunderstandings are, so that you can adapt what you're doing in the moment and make sure that everybody does go through that threshold together. Going back to that idea of those threshold concepts. If you've got children going through with misconceptions that are perfectly plausible, then it's going to be really, really hard to undo those later. So yeah, really, really interesting work that you've done there around the use of hinge questions and threading multiple choice into that as well. What do you think about this? Is something that I've read a little bit about recently from Kate Jones. This idea of having a multiple choice hinge question, but also having an I don't know option there. What are the kind of challenges of that and the pros as well, as you see them?
Well, the pros of using multiple choice, and we've kind of used this early on because it's quite an easy concept to get on board with, not only for teachers and pupils. So if you take it from the teacher's point of view, writing a multiple choice question, when you start thinking about the deliberate distractors and throwing in some common misconceptions, teachers can hook onto that quite easy, and it's a very quick way of assessing the children. You can do that through mini whiteboards or just by showing on your fingers 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a very quick and rapid way of assessing the children. So that's from the teacher's point of view. And then if you think from the pupil's point of view, having up to 4 options laid out in a multiple choice question takes the pressure off having to draw extensively from a blank canvas, almost from a question. Having those options there sort of takes the pressure off the child, and they can then read those options, and then hopefully the idea of reading the correct answer triggers the learning in from their memory. In terms of the I don't know concept, I'm not too familiar with that. You'll have to explain that one to me.
So essentially, you just have your 4 options, but then you'd also have a 5th option, which is I don't know.
Of course.
It's far less technical than what it sounds when I first said it, perhaps.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really interesting thing to put in. I think that could tell you a lot more if the child is saying I don't know, and you've kind of given them the right answer, some plausible answers, and some misconceptions. That would identify a real gap that's happened over the course of the learning, and allow you as a teacher to then go back and touch on that where sort of relevant and where sort of manageable, I suppose.
The only thing I can see with it though is that if you've got 4 options and you've deliberately chosen deliberate distractors, which are by their very nature plausible, so they could very well look like the answer and appear to be the answer, then the likelihood is in many cases that children are going to be going, okay, I'm pretty sure the answer's A, but I'm only about 80% sure, right? Because again, they've got those distractors there. So does the child in that moment then go, so therefore I don't know? Because they equate knowing to being 100% sure. And so therefore you get a room full of I don't knows. So that's just another thought to it, I suppose. And I guess, again, it's all about setting that routine. And the more often you do it, the better children get at that routine. I guess another way you could do that is if you were to think of it as like on a scale, with like a scaling system. So perhaps you go, is it A, B, C, or D, and then I don't know, rate your confidence out of 5. So a child would put A on the whiteboard, and then like a 4 in the corner if they're pretty confident on it, or A but 1 in the corner if they think I'm pretty sure it's that, but I'm a little bit sketchy.
What do I think about that? I think they're really good things to work towards, and I think as the assessment sort of procedures develop in my school and in the project, and I think they're really nice things to be able to work towards in the future. But I think right now in sort of the infancy, I think Rome wasn't built in a day, so you want to try and build up to things like that. So at the moment, that's definitely we're definitely sort of at the multiple choice stage, with the idea of maybe moving towards maybe more open-ended questions, and then different techniques that you've just spoken to there would be a really good direction of travel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think there's a danger in education. I think that if we think we're not doing something absolutely perfectly, so if someone else has got a slightly more developed version of what we're doing than us, we can end up feeling like we've sort of completely failed on it. And of course, that's not the case at all. It is all about sort of building up that practice over time, and through sheer engagement with the use of multiple choice hinge questions, and thinking about the time and the point in the lesson when you use them. That alone is going to be a vast improvement on probably what was going to be in place without that. It's a really good point to make. I think you also made a great point about choosing the point at which you put that hinge question in there, and it makes me think a little bit of David Ajabel's research on meaningful learning that Sarah Cottingham has sort of written up into a modern translation, really. And this idea that that not all knowledge is created equal, and that some knowledge is so meaningful and so powerful because it's going to inform what comes next, that you've absolutely got to prioritize that, and you've got to make sure that you nail that particular knowledge. And it strikes me that that's the kind of knowledge that you should be building multiple choice hinge questions around, because if you've got misconceptions on those things, it's going to negatively affect what comes next. Which again chimes back to David Didow's work on threshold concepts as well. So it all kind of ties together quite nicely. But I think what you've given us there is a really nice picture of exactly how you might use those hinge questions in lessons. So that's great. Should we move on to think about assessment as learning? Because that's probably the one that people talk about and think about the least often. Assessment of learning is pretty common and has been there for a number of years. Assessment for learning, likewise, but I feel like assessment for learning has probably moved on quite a bit over the last 5-6 years or so. But assessment as learning is a concept that's still kind of emerging, really.
Yeah, definitely. So assessment as learning is those sorts of assessment activities where you're really aiming for your students to deepen, strengthen, or even reinforce the knowledge that you've touched upon over your sort of sequence of lessons, or even in the lesson itself, I suppose. It's using those persistent retrieval practices to enable them to get that memory, that learning from their short or long-term memory back into their working memory, then to strengthen their recall there. Where we've framed it in our school in terms of using those hinge questions that we've just sort of touched on, getting that we've started using a lot more focus on sort of retrieval practice of what the children have learnt before, just to constantly relearn what they've done there. So I think I was talking to you about this the other day when we were planning this, but the idea of when you get those gusto meals and you've got the recipe card, you follow it over and over again. But just because I can follow that doesn't mean I can cook the meal from scratch. I need to keep being tested on that over and over again, and I keep needing that recipe card to come back to. So the idea of keep going back to that recipe card, if we use that analogy, that's me being tested over and over again. And because I need that card, I haven't learnt it. And then as time goes by, once I've cooked that meal a dozen times, there are steps in it that I don't have to rely on anymore. And that's where the true learning has come in. So if we now relate that back to school, instead of my very poor analogy, the the idea is that the children are constantly trying to retrieve that information, and because they're having to retrieve it so often, that embeds itself in their memory more often. And some of the reasons that we sort of had to sort of, this lends itself to some things better than others. So, for example, rocks and soils that quite commonly gets covered in year two. That's quite a hard topic to make broader links to, for example. So, what we want to do is we have to manufacture those opportunities to sort of quiz the children and bring that knowledge back to the forefront, because that sort of key knowledge about rocks, although you're not kind of using rocks and soils across much of the curriculum, you then kind of need that understanding of rocks and soils, so that when you come to learn about coastal erosion in geography, you understand why erosion happens, because of that sedimentary rock, because of the nature of it. And if you just cover rocks and soils in a unit and don't really ever come back to it, it's quite on the face of it, rocks and soils can be a relatively mundane topic, but by creating those opportunities to keep coming back to it over and over again and keeping a key piece of substantive knowledge that they're going to need, making sure that they can convert into their long-term memory, that means when they come to other topics, they're able to make those greater links.
Absolutely. And I think what you're coming back to there is a little bit around curriculum design as well. And that's really good, because it's one of the things that I find a lot when I talk to people in schools, is that they kind of see curriculum design as one box over here, and then assessment of the curriculum as a separate box. But of course, the two are so intertwined and so closely related. And as you say, with your example of rocks and soils, so we're going to teach about rocks and soils, but then later on we're going to teach about coastal erosion. And that teaching on coastal erosion is an opportunity to retrieve that knowledge that we had earlier on rocks and soils, right? So it's the learning itself serves as a retrieval opportunity, and that retrieval opportunity, if it's done right, if you run it as like an assessment task, so you're not just giving the information back to the children again, but you're actually asking them to retrieve it from their long-term memory, perhaps with a cue, but if they can, then without it, then that assessment activity of remembering what they know about rocks and soils adds to and contributes to the learning that's to come when they learn about coastal erosion. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic point to make, and I think it draws the relationship between curriculum design and assessment really, really clearly. What about, and this is something that I think is well worth touching on. So when we're thinking about assessment as learning, one of and we've touched on it a little bit already with retrieval practice, but in terms of how retrieval should look in a lesson, at the start of the lesson, throughout a lesson, at the end of a lesson, what are your thoughts on that? Because there's so much talk out there and so much practice that where people want to be doing the right thing, but I think often are kind of getting a little bit muddled up with retrieval practice and the routine of retrieval practice. So trying to apply what we know about retrieval practice and apply what the research says, apply it into a routine, but then by applying it into a routine in too much of a hard and fast way, we don't then end up having the flexibility with retrieval practice that actually gives us the greatest gains from it. Would you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, so I think I've got two things spring to mind there in terms of retrieval practice. I think can be done badly kind of at the start of the lesson as just a bit of a nod to, oh, what did we do last lesson? And I suppose as teachers, it's sort of very natural to hark back to that previous lesson and check in the learning from there. But it's about being a bit more strategic with it, I think. So, for example, like if you're about to teach a lesson on light and dark in science and sort of circuits and electricity, it's about harking back to when was the last related concept that the children came across for that? Is it in your own unit of work as their class teacher, or are you having to go back to maybe the previous year where they may have touched upon sources of electricity and natural and man-made sources of electricity, not natural sources of electricity, but natural and man-made sort of power sources and light sources? Are you having to go back to something like that from a previous year group and touch on the most relevant learning for them, rather than just sort of trotting out what did we do last lesson. It's about really strategically thinking about what is it the children need to know by the end of my lesson, what do they need to know coming into it, and so I need to go back to it, and those building blocks. And again, thinking about being really strategic with it, what we've tried doing in my school is a lot of the work that we've done in our school, and we did this a lot in our maths curriculum, was working off the evidence of Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. And for anybody that's not familiar with that, that's sort of the rate at which you forget newly taught information. And it's a really sudden steep drop off, and really interesting to read about as well if anyone is interested. I think from going from memory, because I don't have the graph in front of me, annoyingly, but sort of the drop off of forgetting new material drops off really steeply within like 20 minutes, an hour, and then it starts tracking it over days. And then what we've done as a school, and then I've started building into our assessment routines in our foundation subjects, is sort of building in those checkpoints. And then Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, his research basically says if you can top up that learning by going back to it, you get it back to that retention rate. So we took that evidence and used it in our maths curriculum particularly. And as I said, I've sort of laid it into our assessment practices in foundation. We went for a 1 day, 3 days, 7, 14, 21 and 28. And so what we've done at the start of our foundation lessons is build in what did you learn in the previous lesson. So that's 7 days ago. The lesson before that, 14, 3 weeks ago, 21, and then 4 weeks ago, 28. And if we're building that in, and as I said, that is with this sort of the condition where if there's a more relevant substantive piece of knowledge that you've got to build on, that should be in there as well, or instead of. So in terms of retrieval practice, I think just sort of summing it up is being really strategic about what do you want the children to remember for your lesson, but then also giving opportunities to retrieve what you've taught most recently in the sequence of learning.
Yeah, I love that. I think being strategic about it is such a good way to kind of umbrella the whole thing. And like you say, it's about making sure that, okay, if I'm about to teach a lesson in history, and in that lesson we're going to be looking at monarchy, right? When was the last time in our curriculum that our children learned about monarchy? What did they learn about monarchy at that time? So, for example, if they're in year one, if they learned about constitutional monarchy and they studied Queen Elizabeth and King Charles, and in year two they learn about dual monarchy with Victoria and Albert, and then they get to year three and they're about to learn and they're studying the Anglo-Saxons and they're about to learn about heptarchy. It's going back to what we already know about dual monarchy and constitutional monarchy to then inform what we're about to learn about monarchy in the Anglo-Saxon model. So a good retrieval practice activity, as if I'm reading what you're saying correctly, is that a good retrieval practice activity for that lesson would be something around monarchy that we learned in year two and the monarchy the stuff that we learned in year one. Have I read that right, do you reckon?
Yeah, you've summed it up much better than I explained it in the first place.
No, not at all. Then, what you then moved on to talk about, and I think this is really, really interesting, right? So Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, and I guess it's important to point out, I suppose, that the kind of validity of the findings from Ebbinghouse's research is sometimes questionable just because he was the subject of his own research. But nonetheless, it does give us a pattern for how forgetting works. And you're right that obviously there is that steep drop off immediately after something's been learned, and that tells us that if we interrupt that forgetting at those key points, that we can then top that understanding back up to 100% where it was when we initially taught it, which is great. And I totally get that with maths in particular, because you're teaching it every day, and I know because when we've planned this together. And we've made sure that in our school, because full disclosure here, we do actually work together, Matt and I. in our school, we have it so that early morning work is always maths focused, and it's what we did a day ago, 3 days ago, 7 days ago, and 21 days ago. So you've got those natural interrupting points. So we're interrupting those key bits of knowledge at those key points. But how does that work then with the foundation subjects when in most schools you're going to be teaching them once a week?
Yeah, you're right. You can't, as much as we're looking to raise the profile of foundation subjects, they're not the same as those core subjects. We're not coming across them nearly as much. So that's why we went very deliberately sort of for that retrieval practice at the start of the lesson, the 7, 14, 21, 28 days ago, just sort of trying to constantly top up that learning, and then putting other, I think we were going to talk about this slightly later, so I won't go into too much detail now, but taking opportunities to sort of interrupt that forgetting, as you put it so nicely. We've actually put in tasks midweek, sort of 3-4 days after you've taught your foundation subject lesson. Say you teach your science lesson on a Tuesday, then on Friday afternoon you'll very quickly come back and touch base on the concepts in that lesson and what you learnt in that lesson to try and interrupt that forgetting. And then by the time you come round to your science lesson the Tuesday of the following week, you're not having to recall what you learned from a week ago. You're actually only going back a couple of days when you touched upon it a few days ago. So we're just trying to be really strategic on where we put in those sort of interrupting points. So it isn't just a week's gap, because those foundation subjects are a week in between. And the sort of, there isn't as much as a heavy emphasis and profile in those subjects as there is in reading, writing, and maths, obviously, because they're assessed at the end of key stages.
Yeah, I think the important bit there as well is to think about the fact that you don't have to, when we say interrupt forgetting, it doesn't mean reteach the whole lesson. It's about going back to, okay, that lesson that I taught on Monday, what was the really key, most meaningful, most powerful knowledge, that threshold concept, if you like, that I covered in that lesson. That's the bit that I want them to retrieve now, on Thursday afternoon. And that could literally just be a question on the whiteboard as they come in from lunch. Everybody get your whiteboards out. I want you to think about and answer this question. Go. And it takes sort of 15, 20 minutes, but it's just that it's the thinking that they're doing that's key here. And I think that's so key when you're thinking about all kinds of task design and question design. It's what is the thinking that you're making those children do as a result of the question you're asking or the task that you're giving them, and giving them that opportunity to retrieve that information, that really key information, 3 days after it's been taught. When you're then also going to give them another opportunity 4 days after that. So therefore, after the 7th day, it's just that lovely extra retrieval opportunity. And I think, this is something that often gets missed out, but it's creating that culture with children that actually remembering stuff is important. So, if I come back to something on the Thursday, having taught it to you on the Monday, the fact that I'm giving you that question as you come in from lunch on the Thursday, it tells you that, learning isn't, we don't want learning anyway to be transient. It's not about how you do in that moment. It's about what you can remember. And there's value in remembering stuff. And I think that also then feeds into this idea about, when we're giving them these retrieval practice questions or these retrieval opportunities, and children are having a go at them, if they're getting them wrong, it's really important that they get feedback on it as well. And that's something that we see missed out a lot with retrieval practice activities, is that teachers sometimes will go, okay, there's your do now on the board, have a go, see how you get on, a little bit of circulation perhaps. But then the teacher then sort of returns to the front, goes, right, here are there was 5 questions. Here are the answers to all 5. Hands up if you got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Brilliant. Now let's get into our lesson. When in actual fact, if you've got misconceptions, or if you've got particular pieces of that really meaningful learning that haven't been secured and grasped, you've got to go back to that and give children feedback on it to make sure that they've got the right understanding before you move on, particularly if it's knowledge that they're going to need in the lesson that you're about to teach as well. Sorry, but I went off on a bit of a rant there, Matt. But have you got anything else to add to that?
No, I thought you had some good points. I think I think what's important to note is I think when we think of assessment in foundation subjects and sort of trying to raise it to a similar bar to maths, reading, I think the natural inclination is to think that's a huge task. No one's really suggesting that you're going to be running intervention groups because your children didn't understand about poverty in Victorian times when you teach that in year 2, say, for example, as they do in our school. No one's suggesting that you're going to have to run interventions based on that. It's just about constantly providing opportunities to assess, have they got those key concepts, and in a sort of light touch way, come back to it, and as you say, give the children feedback from that, or that feeds directly into maybe your next lesson. That actually I need to spend longer going over that within the lesson, or it might even feed into your whole curriculum design where you actually think, right, well, this piece of substantive knowledge isn't as sticky as we thought, so we're going to have to do some work around do we stretch that concept out over a number of lessons? Do we break it down even further? But yeah, just listening to you speak, I know when the idea of first bringing in assessment into the foundation subjects, you do kind of think, oh, I really don't have time to be making sure that every piece of knowledge is remembered in across 12 different subjects if you include the core subjects as well. So it's just really trying to touch on what are those real important pieces of knowledge that really become sort of the building blocks of your curriculum for each subject.
Yeah, I love that. I think you've summed that up really, really well. What are the key building blocks for the subject? And that's the knowledge that you want to prioritise. Okay, so we've talked a lot there about assessment for learning, and we talked about multiple choice hinge questions, a little bit about the use of mini whiteboards, and particularly, and I think, and this is really, really key, and I'm so glad that the conversation kind of went this way as well, is that it's not about use mini whiteboards because they're good, or use multiple choice hinge questions because they're good. It's about look at this overall principle, right? You got this, and in this case, it's a threshold concept, and we want kids to be thinking hard about those threshold concepts, and we need to know if they've got misconceptions. So that's the principle that we're working towards. That's almost like the learning goal, if you like, or the teaching goal, and then we're going to construct our strategy from that. So I think that was really, really important to grasp from this first section, that it's not about a list of strategies that we just kind of sprinkle in like hundreds and thousands. It's a case of matching the strategy to the purpose. And I think, it was really good to hear your thoughts there on assessment for learning and that practice overall. We talked a lot there also about assessment as learning and the use of retrieval within that. We glossed over assessment of learning, and I think we're planning to come back to that in a little while. So we won't go into any more detail on that now. But what we will do next is we'll tackle the big topic area, which is the substantive and disciplinary knowledge, the interplay of those two things together. And hopefully you're going to tell us exactly what they are, so that everybody's really, really clear on that before we dive into that part of our conversation in more depth. But before we get to that, we have a little bit of a breather. And we're going to have some messages from our friends and sponsors.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs. The first story this week is once again Ofsted. Following last week's news that, contrary to advice from the cross-party committee in the House of Commons, the government would persist with single-word assessments of schools. This week, Ofsted Chief Sir Martin Oliver announced that he would like Ofsted inspections to feel more like a peer review. At the Schools and Academies show on the 2nd of May, Sir Martin indicated that Ofsted had embarked on a reform journey, and he further noted that he wanted Ofsted inspections to feel like, in some ways, a peer review system. While Ofsted and Sir Martin have launched the Big Listen consultation, a group of former Ofsted inspectors, academics, experienced teachers and head teachers, led by Professor Colin Richards and Frank Norris MBE, have launched the alternative Big Listen. They've set up their own website and are accepting responses and views from across the education world. The 50% rule in English faith school admissions, introduced in 2010, stipulating that where newly established academies with a religious character are oversubscribed, at least 50% of their places would be open places, i.e. allocated without reference to faith, is to be scrapped in plans announced by the government. The government also plans to allow churches and religious groups to open faith-based schools for children with special educational needs, which campaigners warned could raise ethical issues. Proposals to scrap the 50% cap, which only applies when schools have more applicants than places, are opposed by Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, on the grounds that it would be divisive and likely to penalise disadvantaged children by denying them access to local schools. While the government believes that faith-based schools give parents greater choice, encourage better behaviour, and also academic outcomes, Andrew Copston, the chief executive of Humanist UK, is quoted as saying, "The proposal to allow 100% religious discrimination in new state faith schools will increase religious and racial segregation." Teaching assistants are again in the news this week. While recent stories of their declining numbers, their stagnating pay, have been regular features of the news, this week a survey reported in Secondary Education News involving 6,000 teaching assistants in England and Wales found that 39% are covering classes for at least 5 hours a week. A further 15% say they are leading full classes for at least 11 hours a week. National guidance states that support staff should not actively teach any classes they cover, but 75% of the teaching assistants said they have ended up teaching rather than supervising. Astria Academy Trust, which controls 26 schools in the Yorkshire and Cambridgeshire area, is seeking to hire a new executive head teacher on a salary between $116,000 and $133,000 a year. These salaries might seem generous in the light that the St Ivo Academy, a secondary school in St Ives and run by the Trust, is making cuts for classroom resources, but it should also be placed in the light that the new executive principal position comes with 3 layers of management above it. Above the new executive principal would be Secondary Regional Director for Cambridgeshire, Jo Mayhill Johnson. Above her, in the Trust's hierarchy, sits Richard Tutt, its Director for Secondary Education, and above him, Rowena Hackwood, Astria's Chief Executive. And the number of Astria's employees paid at least $100,000 a year has increased from 7 to 10 from 2022 to 2023. It is reported that Ofqual have warned that exam results, GCSE and A-level, will be down this year. This will be the result of the return to pre-pandemic conditions, meaning candidates had no prior warning of what might be coming up in the exams, and the lost learning that resulted from the COVID pandemic. In an interview in Education Week, the statistician Dennis Sherwood once again stated his view that A-level and GCSE grades are only reliable to one grade either way. If you wish to listen to interviews with Dennis Sherwood, you can find them in the Teachers Talk Radio back catalogue, or follow many of these news items on the weekly review on Sunday mornings. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs. Thank you for listening.
Okay, Matt, welcome back. So, just before we move on there, a bit of a shout out to RTAs at Birkbeck Primary School, and good to hear that they're getting their messages, their voice heard. In the news this week as well. They are an absolutely wonderful part of our workforce, work incredibly hard, and we simply couldn't do it without them. So it's good for them to be having that voice. Matt, shall we dive into substantive and disciplinary knowledge then? Let's start off with what's the difference, just for anybody that wants that clarified before we go any further.
So with substantive and disciplinary knowledge, I always think back to it, when we had the trend of splitting all of our curriculum into knowledge and skills, and I remember having to write various curriculum maps where I split the whole curriculum, my subject that I was doing, into the knowledge and the skills, and feeling it was quite arduous at the time. And I think kind of substantive and disciplinary knowledge is just a bit of an evolution of that, really. So substantive knowledge is kind of, in my thinking, and I don't know if you agree, that sort of the key information, those key sort of pieces of learning that the children have to know in order to be able to engage with the materials that we go through. And then disciplinary knowledge is the type of thinking that you do, which would be different in each subject. So I think the best way to think of it, I think, is through some examples. So, for example, we spoke about rocks before, didn't we? So the substantive knowledge that you need is to know how different types of rock behave, but your disciplinary knowledge is explaining the process of, as we said, coastal erosion. Or, for example, in Stone Age in Year 3, when you're learning about the Stone Age, and sorry, background of my children, my fan club.
They obviously love. Yeah, I was going to say, you've got a fan club in the back there. It's either they're fans of you or they're massive fans of the Stone Age.
If you're learning about the Stone Age in Year 3, you need to have the substantive knowledge of the features of different time periods. For example, so you've got your three different time periods, the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic eras. You've got to know what the features of those were, so that, for example, then when you see a source and a picture of Skara Brae, the disciplinary knowledge is having an opinion on that source. So having an opinion and reading into that image of Skara Brae, you need to have that substantive knowledge to know, well, actually, that was a village settlement, so they've moved on from farming and they're not hunter-gatherers anymore. You can then look at that source and say, right, well, now they almost had places where we think they were kind of keeping their trinkets and things that they were making. And what does this tell us about early humans in that time period? And I suppose it's very easy to reach for history, I think, in these examples. But for example, in art, you need to have a bit of a background knowledge of an artist. So that way you can interpret their meaning, being the disciplinary side of that. So you need to have a bit of a background knowledge of, say, Banksy. And when you're thinking about social and political messages, you need to have that background knowledge of that artist or other artists like Banksy, is the most famous that springs to mind, before you can then use the disciplinary knowledge within art of interpreting meaning of artists. So yeah, like, what do you think?
So yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of two parts to it in terms of my thoughts, I guess. I think the way I see it is that, as you said, the substantive knowledge is the accepted fact and the accepted way that things are within the subject, and the disciplinary knowledge is the methods that we went through to establish that knowledge. So yeah, and that's where I think the disciplinary knowledge in each subject is so different. because the methods that we go through, and I think that's really that's what you were getting at, I think, in those examples you just gave, the methods that we use in each of those different disciplines to come to an understanding of how things are within the discipline is really unique to each of those subjects. The link that, and again, it's important, I think, to keep linking assessment back to curriculum design, because one is it's closing that loop all the time from curriculum design right the way round to assessment, and then back to retweaking the curriculum design as a result. So I think when I think about work that I've done previously around the trivium and the which was the medieval model of curriculum, and then the medieval times, that I'll give you a little quick history for anybody that's listening doesn't know and is interested. I think it's fascinating personally. But the medieval times, they had 7 pillars of the curriculum. They had the quadrivium and the trivium. The trivium being of word and the quadrivium being of number. And the trivium is made up of 3 areas. So you've got the grammar, which doesn't refer to sort of written grammar, although that is a part of it. But the grammar refers to that kind of underpinning stuff, the accepted facts and way that things are in a particular subject. Then you've got your dialectic, which is the thinking and the challenging and the formulation of opinions around using that grammar. And that's really important, I think, because we spent a long time in education trying to teach children to think. Whereas now, I think, happily, over the last sort of 10 years or so, we've understood that actually what we've got to do is give them more to think with. But in terms of the link to substantive and disciplinary knowledge, it's about really understanding how we think in that particular discipline and how we challenge and how we formulate opinions in that particular discipline. And as an example, you've got with art, it is very much about expressing an opinion, whereas in science, it's very much about finding proof. And so it's slightly different types of dialectic thinking that you want children to be doing in those spaces, in those different subjects. And then on from that into the rhetoric, which is what you actually do once you've got your understanding formulated from the grammar that you started with. And in the medieval times, you were pretty limited in that, I guess. It would have been like the priesthood or like law, maybe. But now, obviously, children have got so many options open to them with what they go on to do, that it makes it all the more important that they understand the discipline that they're actually studying, the discipline that they're learning about, and that we give them that wide repertoire of understanding of how each discipline is actually different. And that also comes back to critical thinking. And there's been a lot of discourse recently on critical thinking and whether you can teach generic critical thinking skills. And ultimately, if I'm going to nail my colours to the mast, I don't think you can. I think it is entirely context specific and is dependent on, again, the discipline that you're looking at. I think dependent on the discipline that you're in, that dictates the type of critical thinking that you're going to be doing. So that would sort of be my take on it in terms of making that distinction between substantive and disciplinary. But I think the key point, and hopefully that comes across from what I've said, is that although there is a distinction in terms of definition, the interplay between the two is really the key thing. Without the substantive, you just can't have the disciplinary. It's a bit like, and it does come back, funnily enough, to the knowledge and skills debate that you started off with. I saw someone the other day put on X that the knowledge versus skills is like saying ingredients versus cake. So it's like you can't have the cake without the ingredients. And I think that to a large extent, disciplinary knowledge and substantive knowledge have a similar relationship. You can't properly understand the discipline of history unless you've got a solid base of substantive knowledge to base your understanding on. So yeah, that would be my take. And I guess then that sort of feeds into the next question, which is, within the context of assessment, what are the challenges with dealing with these two distinct types of knowledge, substantive and disciplinary? We haven't even touched on tacit knowledge, which probably haven't got time for tonight, but let's stick to substantive and disciplinary. What do you think the challenges are in terms of assessment?
It's important to sort of build your substantive knowledge from the foundation up. So the sequencing becomes really important there, making sure that they've got enough knowledge to be able to think with and build up. Sorry. Yeah, so being sure that they've got enough knowledge to be able to think with. So the challenge is really in the sequencing, and we've had to do a lot of work with sort of rearranging various things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the key bit there as well is that it's really easy to kind of fall into the trap of thinking that the discipline of history is broadly the same in any year group. And it's a trap that I think a lot of people fall into. So sometimes with schools that have created end of unit tests, let's say it's one that everybody's probably got some experience of, often you'll look at a year 2 end of unit test and you'll look at, okay, this question here seems to be asking children to apply some of this disciplinary knowledge that they've got. They've been given a picture of the streets of London at the time, and that's a source, and they're being asked to do something quite broad with it, like, evaluate from this source what you know about one of the causes of the Great Fire. And then you look at what they're being asked to do in year 6 when they study World War II, and it will be something really, really similar. So again, it will be like, here's a photograph of soldiers on the front line. What does this tell you about life on the front line? And actually, in terms of complexity, that hasn't really moved on very much. So it's really important to consider how within each of those key disciplinary concepts, and in the example I've just given there, that key disciplinary concept is source, I would say, and that's a really key concept within history. But how is that concept becoming increasingly challenging as pupils move up through the curriculum? I think that's a really, really important thing to consider when we come to designing assessment opportunities, whether you're designing like an end of unit test that takes in lots of all of the different disciplinary and substantive knowledge, or at least some of it, or the most important parts of it, I should say, from across that unit, or whether it's an end of year test that does the same thing but over the entire year, or if it's just an assessment task or activity that you're asking pupils to do at the end of a lesson or at the end of a unit within their lesson. So however you set that up, it's really important to just be conscious of, have I pitched this correctly for the year group that I'm in, and how do I know that? And that's where I think leaders can support teachers with. I'm not sure where I stand on the kind of progression debate, on whether progressions in everything are absolutely necessary. But what I do think leaders need to do, and I do think that often a progression document is the thing that we fall back on, for better or worse. What I do think leaders need to do is support teachers in knowing that they're pitching that disciplinary knowledge that they're testing correctly for the year group that they're in at that particular time. I just wanted to touch on one thing actually, which was your point about sequencing. And why it is so important as well, and making sure that we kind of see that substantive knowledge as building up towards creating this disciplinary understanding at the end. And when we talked about this the other day, my mind instantly flashed back in some sort of like PTSD way, I think, to a lesson I taught when I was teaching year 4 in like my second or third year of teaching. And I think I said last week when I was talking to Paul Klein that I was a terrible teacher when I started teaching, like, seriously not very good at all. And by the time I'd sort of got 2 or 3 years in, I was sort of getting a bit better, of finding my feet a little bit. But still, like 2 or 3 years in, I was teaching this lesson in year 4 in science. It was the first lesson in a unit of work on electricity, and I'd spread out all of the electrical equipment around the room on all the tables. And I was like, right, guys, this, all of the equipment's out on the tables. What I want you to do, I want you to go around, and I want you to use the wires and the bulbs and the buzzers, and I want you to see if you can make this bulb come on. And I was sort of envisaging this incredible like inquiry thing where children were like problem solving and collaborating. It was just going to be this joyous moment. And obviously, like within like a minute, children were like tying each other up with wires and like genuinely fighting over who had the red wire and stuff like that. And eventually a bulb did come on, but no one had any idea why that had come on at all. And so there was no learning whatsoever. And I know we're kind of getting into there like this, the discovery learning versus direct instruction debate. And I absolutely think there's a place for both, but where there is definitely not a place for that kind of discovery-based approach is where people are going straight for that, straight to the idea of trying to get children to use that disciplinary knowledge right at the very start of a unit of work that children have got no prior knowledge of at all, because it will almost always end in complete disaster, as it did for me. So I just think that point that you made about sequencing and the importance of sequencing is it was really vital, really kind of chimed with me. Shall we get on to curriculum endpoints, because that's again, it kind of feeds in a little bit from what we were saying about being clear on that progression and understanding that, you know, the disciplinary knowledge that you're teaching at that particular point is pitched correctly and is more complex than what came before it, but not as complex as what is to come after it. And to get that right, you've got to be really clear on what your curriculum endpoints are. Do you want to dive into that for us?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, like, as we said from the beginning of our conversations, there are really clear endpoints in your core subjects, in reading, writing and maths, and you've got those end of key stage expectations, which are very clear. People spend a huge amount of time working towards. And it's not always as clear in those foundation subjects. Certainly when you look at the national curriculum, you know, you can go from it being sort of heavily prescriptive in some areas like history about exactly what to teach, but actually kind of the endpoint is a bit woolly, really. So it's really the job of school leaders and subject leaders as well within school about creating really clear endpoints. And what we've done is, as I've said throughout this conversation, we've got our medium-term plans and highlighted off what are the key substantive pieces of knowledge that the children need to be checking off as they go. And then what we've started doing is getting the teachers to base like their tests and things around that substantive knowledge, so they really know what they're working towards there. And those endpoints having been broken down not only within your own year group, but being able to see what were they broken down with, what components were they broken down to in sort of the previous year groups or even ahead. So you can see that real clear sort of that route of travel throughout a child's life in school, in science, in geography, through, so they know, you know, where are you on that child's journey towards getting to here. So for example, in year 6, by the end of year 6 in sort of monarchy, we want our children to be understand how monarchy can assert control and how it's the sort of links between that and democratic systems and how significant power is used. And then making sure that we've sort of taken that back and say, right, well, that's quite a big concept to have. How have we made that look different in year 3? And how do you first introduce that even into year 1? And so it's really important there to have those really clear endpoints for teachers, so they know what they're working towards and kind of, what do I almost need? We all have a checkbox sort of idea, don't we? What must my children know by the end of this sort of topic, by the end of their time with me in year 2? What must they know about monarchy before I send them on their way into year 3?
Fantastic. I think that really ties together a lot of what we were talking about in that last section, really around the importance of sequencing and how disciplinary knowledge feeds interplays with substantive knowledge. So I'm just a little bit conscious of time, and I really want to get onto this next bit because I think this bit is truly fascinating. So I wanted to talk about how we understand learning and performance in terms of assessment, and how we can make sure that we are definitely assessing learning and not performance within the particular context of assessment of learning. So we're looking at an assessment from which we're going to try to draw some kind of summative inference. How do we make sure that we're assessing learning and not performance? And what have you done with the kind of structure and spacing of the assessments that you've introduced at Birkbeck to make sure that we are more confident that we're assessing learning, not performance?
Again, thinking about the difference between learning and actual performance, I know certainly anyone that's been teaching for a little while will probably have had experience of the necessity of getting your children's learning, in inverted quotes, down into their books to almost prove that you taught that lesson and they learnt it. And it's about sort of helping staff and all of us really understand is, what that child may have got down in that book was just sort of their performance in that lesson. Learning, you used a lovely quote at the start, and you've used it in our school quite often about learning being the residue of thought, or memory being the residue of thought. I think I've probably really taken that phrase and murdered it.
No, I love that. I love what you did there, because it is memory as residue of thought, absolutely. But the relationship between memory and learning is so important that it's really easy to merge them together, which is what you've done there. It was quite poetic.
So it's, even though we've all had those children where in that one lesson they seem to really, they've done it and you really think that they understand it, and then you come back to asking them that week later and it's kind of gone completely from their head. So it's really making sure that actually getting our teachers to understand that if they can't remember it, they haven't learnt it. They just did really well in that lesson. They got it at the time. And it's coming back to that thing over and over again. And this is where we sort of touched on assessment as learning at the beginning of our conversation today. If they can recall it quickly enough from their long-term memory, then that shows that they've learnt it, and it's not just performance. And I think putting in spaced practice really helps there, and you get a lot of gains from that. So where we've spoken today about putting in those strategic sort of assessment places, to come back to it, that's what we're aiming for, to make sure that we've left enough space there for them to potentially forget it, but really what we're hoping for is to leave enough space there that they've actually remembered it, and strengthen those links in their memory. So for example, what I've been working towards in terms of our end of unit assessments is actually leaving a 3-week gap we're trialing at the moment between kind of finishing your topic on electricity in spring 2, but then actually not coming back and assessing that for a couple of weeks when you come into summer 1 to see actually how has your learning fared over that big gap between the last time we taught it, rather than just a test in that last lesson, and they remember not only what you sort of talked about in that lesson alone, but then you've also got the retrieval practice that you've done from the previous 4 weeks. So it's sort of putting in lots of opportunities to forget, like I said, but ultimately we want them to not forget. We're trying to give them lots of opportunities to recall that learning. So yeah, weekly recall that we've touched on, and then sort of just making them think. But I think, yeah, there are certain challenges to leaving that in. So as we've said, like the gaps between your timetable really in teaching those subjects, and then making sure that, like I said, we're trialing a 3-week test at the end, and we're going to be sort of finding out the results of that kind of this week about, is that too long, especially with, in this case, quite a long Easter holiday, really. And then ensuring that really, is it the important knowledge that is retained, or did they just remember that Johnny fell off his chair in that lesson, and then they completely forgot that Henry was crowned on the battlefield of the Battle of Bosworth, which is kind of what you're trying to aim for.
Love the reference to Bosworth there, not Hastings.
Thank you. Just to prove I do know it, and I got it right.
That's it. I mean, I think that is really, really key. The fact, and I love this idea of leaving this 3-week gap between the end of the unit and when you're testing, because you are deliberately allowing that forgetting to take place. And we know that forgetting is not the enemy of learning. If we allow a little bit of forgetting to take place, then remembering becomes more effortful. And when remembering is effortful, it means it's going to be encoded more in a more stable way in long-term memory in the future. Okay, so if anybody's got any thoughts on that at all, on anything that we talked about, please do feel free to call or text in. But just while you have a think on some of what Matt and I have spoken about there, we'll go to another message from our friends and sponsors.
I've always considered myself to be a caring head teacher who acts sensitively to support staff mental health. But what I found increasingly difficult was managing the negative impact on staff mental health when resolving issues related to their employment or daily work. Heartfelt Leadership has been developed by Teachwell Toolkit as a handbook to support head teachers to overcome the challenges of school improvement while supporting staff well-being. We know that difficult conversations can quickly turn into conflict if procedures are not fully transparent, understood and followed. Our handbook takes you through step-by-step processes while maintaining mutual respect, avoiding conflict and finding solutions.
At Bloomsbury Education, we're passionate about supporting teachers with high-quality professional development books from leading experts. Whether you're navigating your first crucial years as an early career teacher or a more experienced teacher looking to refresh your practice or take a step up into leadership, our award-winning books are here to help. We publish practical books to support teaching across primary and secondary, from the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design. Visit the Bloomsbury Education website at bloomsbury.com/education to find out more and use code BLOOMTTR24 to save 20% on all education titles. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Okay, Matt, welcome back. And hi to Andy as well in the chat, who's listening in all the way from Southeast Asia. Love Southeast Asia, so I'm very jealous that you get to spend all your time there. So Matt, leadership of assessment, what are the specific challenges, the leadership challenges that are related to assessment that you found?
So certainly with assessment, you generally feel that staff, especially when it comes to foundation subjects, staff feeling that they're just ticking off a box to show that they assessed it. One of the initial things I brought in when I became assessment lead, we had to get something in place for the foundation subject. So we put in a RAG rating Excel grid against objectives, and after talking to teachers and sort of knowing what I would have been like as well, just sort of I would have been rattling through those objectives and giving my more ables the 3, showing that they'd really understood it, and those children that I knew generally struggled or were falling behind in the curriculum in reading, writing, maths, just say, right, they must struggle in history and geography as well. So it's sort of, there was no real validity to the assessments being made in those subjects, and staff again felt that as well, thinking, right, well, I'm just ticking a box to say that I've done it, really. So then hopefully through this project really is what I'm aiming to do is to help them make their summative judgments easier, because we've built in regular assessment points through the project. Let me start again. We've built in regular assessment points into their teaching, so that actually they're not having to trawl through their child's science book to see if they actually did get it, and they're not having to just rely on how good they are in reading, writing and maths. Their memory of those assessment points and interacting with those children, because we've given more frequent opportunities for assessment, allows that teacher to have maybe a more informed judgment of that child's science work or their music work across the year as well. I think everyone believes I think most teachers would believe in a kind of broad and balanced curriculum, and most of us really enjoy teaching some of those more foundation subjects. I always really enjoyed teaching history. So I think you'd struggle to find a teacher that kind of didn't want to engage and help children learn those topics, especially topics that teachers are passionate about. So to almost coach the whole thing in terms of saying, well, if you really enjoy that subject, surely you'd want to have a really in-depth knowledge of how you're doing in terms of teaching that subject and inspiring that love and that learning in your own subject as well. I think has been one of the other challenges. And then sort of finally, really sort of the workload aspect of it. So really in my project, just to very briefly sort of go through that, my project is getting teachers to do retrieval practice at the start of each lesson, which we've mentioned, to incorporate some early afternoon work where you come back to that key concept from your previous lesson, doing that 3 days later to interrupt that forgetting, and then finally ending each unit with an end of unit quiz. And we've spoken more recently about leaving a little bit of space for that to make that remembering harder. So that's kind of 3 extra things that I'm putting on our staff's plate there. So the idea of coaching that in terms of the workload and how does that feel manageable, I've really had to
not only let them see the value in terms of what we're doing, and as I just sort of spoken about, the sort of people's passion for various subjects, but also making the actual task management of it easy. So those retrieval practice questions, you could have the same key concepts as you're going through the weeks and maybe just change up the questions slightly. And then the early afternoon work is literally just pinching the key concept from your previous lesson and coming back to that and kind of just reframing your question in a slightly different way. So they're not just having to remember the lesson itself. And then the end of unit quizzes that we're doing, that those are the most work at the moment. And so I certainly did the first few as the leader of assessment in my school, but then really sort of supporting our subject leaders in building those assessments. And I know most recently we had an inset day where we were allowing staff to write those and kind of just really phrasing it to the staff that this first quiz might not be everything you want it to be, but we're on a journey to assessing these foundation subjects in a slightly more robust and an evidence-informed way. So we will get there. So I think that's the main thing coming back to it in terms of workload there.
Yeah, and that's obviously a massive consideration, right? So the leadership of everything, workload has to be a massive consideration. But I do think, in terms of what you've described, I think that is not only more purposeful than doing endless tick lists and highlighting off grids and that kind of thing, but also probably takes less time as well. And I think that's really important to remember, that testing, if you are going to do end of unit tests and retrieval practice as you move through a unit as well, that doesn't have to be an onerous thing for teachers. It's if you do it smartly and if you do it in a strategic way, then there shouldn't be an enormous workload implication there at all. And I think another thing that you mentioned in there is value as well. And it's about getting staff to see the value in what you're doing. Everybody wants to do the best by children. That's why we go to work every day. And by getting staff to see that there's value in the practice that you want them to do, they're far more likely to get on board with it, but also get on board with that willingly as well. And I think from my perspective, having watched you lead assessment in our school, that's definitely something you've been able to do. You've got everybody on board with the value of assessment in the way that you see it being done. But undoubtedly, one of the biggest challenges that I think people have with leading assessment in schools is, particularly if you are going to go for any form of testing, is that it's undoing this notion that testing is bad for children. And I think the way that you do that, and I've seen you do this in our school as well, is by going back to the research and saying, well, actually showing staff that actually the research shows that regular testing, if done right, can actually reduce test anxiety when it comes to those high stakes tests. And it is really important, of course, that we don't have high stakes testing all the time and too often, particularly in primary. But the actual act of testing, and it's something we keep coming back to in this show, the actual act of testing working as a learning opportunity in itself is really, really important and can't be underestimated. And so the value of it is not just in assessment of learning, but also in assessment as learning as well. And obviously you've got your assessment for learning advantages when you draw your formative inferences from the data that you collect. The other challenge, I guess, that's worth perhaps touching on is how it looks different in each year group. And I know that when you've looked at year one, you've been really careful in designing the tests to make sure that there are more multiple choice questions available there, that there's questions where children have to move things around and group things together or draw lines to connect stuff, so that there's less of a cognitive demand on their writing if that's underdeveloped in those younger year groups. I suppose the only other thing that I'd probably end with, I guess, on this particular section on leadership, and this is from Rachel Johnson, who I was speaking to recently and reading something that she'd written, and she talked about the leadership of assessment being about four things. She said it's about being curious, number one, so making sure that you've got that culture of curiosity amongst your staff. And Andy, in the chat, you've said there that it's great for bonding. And I think what you mean by that is that it's great for children in a class to go through that assessment experience together and see how they come out of it collectively. But it's also great for staff as well to kind of establish that curious culture around assessment. So, what does this actually tell us and what doesn't it tell us? How valid are the inferences that we're drawing? How reliable is the data that we're getting? So that's one key thing. She then says that it's about giving numbers a story. So looking at the hard data that you produce and then really making sure that you fill in the story around that as well, so that you bring it to life. And I think she says, give it heart, which I love. Being specific about the actions that you're going to take. So when you do draw actions from the assessments that you take, that the children undertake, it's about being really specific with the actions that you're going to take off the back of that. I think that's really super key. Somebody else I was talking to today, Michael Green, was talking about planning in 100-day blocks. So, right, what's the priority in terms of action over these next 100 days? And then we reevaluate at the end of that. And to do that, you've got to be really specific with your actions. And then lastly, Rachel says it's about celebrating every success. So leadership of assessment is about celebrating tiny successes, not just the end of key stage results, but everything across the board. I thought that was a really, really lovely way of framing the challenges, but also the solutions of successful assessment leadership. So we've only got a minute or so left. So just in terms of wrapping up then and looking at next steps, because assessment, like all aspects of education, is never done. And I think it's really important to reflect on where we're at and what we perhaps don't feel we understand as clearly as what we want to. And for me, that's task design. So like I was having a conversation with over Twitter with Emma Turner yesterday, and she was super generous with her time and with her advice on what we were talking about, and thinking about the difference between task design in the national curriculum and continuous provision design in the early years. And that's an area that for me, I don't see as clear a distinction between the thinking that teachers do in those two different areas as what Emma does. And so I just wanted to raise that, because I think the more that we talk about where we're at the moment and where we want to get to next with our understanding, if we're open and almost kind of vulnerable with those areas, people will come out and will give us suggestions and solutions, and we'll move our thinking on. It's when we kind of close off and aren't open with the things that we want to know more about, that's where I think we can kind of stagnate and get stuck. So that would be my closing message tonight is, on this would be that embrace that vulnerability that comes with wanting to know more about these particular areas, put it out there, and there will be people in the world of education that will step forward and help you. Matt, thank you so much for this evening, for everything that we discussed. You were really, really open, and I really enjoyed the conversation that we had. So thank you very much indeed for that. For those of you that are listening to Teachers Talk Radio and want to know what's coming up next, so we've got the Late Show with Ray, which promises to be a fantastic edition of that show as well. So have a lovely rest of the week. Enjoy the show tonight and all the other shows on Teachers Talk Radio that are coming up this week. And hopefully I'll see you again next week.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.